The day Myrtle Merriweather drove her wagon onto the neighboring claim, Benjamin Bancroft had not laughed in exactly 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days, and he had been counting every single one of them. He was standing at his fence line when he heard it, that rattle and clatter of iron wheels on dry Colorado earth, the high whine of a horse working harder than it ought to on a warm April afternoon in 1882. He had been mending wire, his leather gloves stiff at the knuckles, his jaw set in that particular way it had taken to setting itself since the winter of 1879. He did not look up right away. Out on the open plateau east of Durango, where the San Juan Mountains still held snow on their high shoulders and the sage ran flat and silver all the way to the horizon, a man learned quickly that not every sound required his attention. But then the sound stopped, and in the silence that followed came a voice so loud and so unabashed in its frustration that it cracked across the morning like a rifle shot. "You absolute, thick-headed, stubborn beast of a mule." Benjamin looked up. Across the low ridge that separated his claim from the parcel old Harlan Cutter had abandoned 2 seasons back, there was a wagon sitting at a very wrong angle, with one wheel sunk into the soft earth near the dry creek bed, and a woman standing beside it with both fists planted on her hips. She was wearing a dark green dress with the sleeves already rolled to the elbows, and a wide-brimmed hat that sat slightly crooked on a mass of brown hair that was coming undone from its pins. In front of the wagon, tied to the tongue, was indeed a mule, a gray, indifferent creature who appeared to have decided that this particular afternoon was a good one for standing completely still. Benjamin watched for a moment. He told himself he was only looking because the situation was unusual. He told himself it was a neighbor's matter to solve, and he did not insert himself into other people's matters. He had not done so in 3 years, and the habit was comfortable now, like a coat worn so long it had taken the shape of the man inside it. He turned back to his fence wire. A high, sharp whistle split the air behind him, and he turned again despite himself. The woman had found a long stick somewhere and was waving it in the general direction of the wagon wheel, as if directing an orchestra of catastrophe. The mule had not moved. The wheel, however, appeared to have sunk another 2 inches. Benjamin set down his pliers. He told himself it was only because a wagon lost entirely to a sinkhole would be a nuisance on land that bordered his own. He walked to the gate in the fence, opened it, and crossed into what had apparently become someone else's property. Up close, she was younger than he'd expected, perhaps 26 or 27, with dark eyes that caught the mountain light and a complexion that had already seen a fair number of days working outdoors. There was a smear of axle grease on her left forearm that she had not yet noticed. She turned when she heard his boots on the ground, and she looked at him with the frank, assessing expression of a woman who had learned not to waste time on false impressions. "You're the neighbor," she said. "Benjamin Bancroft," he said. He did not offer his hand because both of his were still in his gloves and the introduction felt like enough. "Myrtle Merriweather," she said, and she pointed at the wheel as if he might have missed it. "She went down about 20 minutes ago. I tried rocking the wagon forward and back. I tried laying brush under the wheel. The mule, I have come to realize, has a philosophical objection to effort." Benjamin looked at the wheel, then at the axle, then at the slope of the ground beneath the creek bed. He said nothing for a moment, only walking slowly around the wagon the way a man walks around a problem before he decides to pick it up. There was a length of rope coiled in the wagon bed. There was also, he noticed, an astonishing quantity of goods loaded into that wagon iron cookware, a rocking chair with one leg wrapped in burlap, 3 wooden crates, 2 canvas sacks that said flour on the side, a bird cage containing a very alert yellow canary, and what appeared to be a complete set of encyclopedias. "You planning to stay long?" he asked. "I bought the claim," she said, as if this answered the question, which he supposed it did. He got the rope from the wagon bed without asking, tied it around the axle and brought the other end back to his own fence line where he looped it around a solid post. Then he came back and put his shoulder to the side of the wagon. He told her to lead the mule forward when he said so. She gave him a look that measured him for exactly 3 seconds, then took the mule's halter in both hands. "Now," he said. He pushed. She pulled. The mule, confronted with the combined force of 2 human wills, apparently reconsidered its philosophy and moved. The wheel came up out of the mud with a sucking sound that was deeply undignified, and the wagon lurched forward onto firm ground. Myrtle steadied the mule and turned around, and for a moment she looked at the wagon and then at Benjamin with an expression that was equal parts relief and something else he could not immediately name. "Thank you," she said. "Genuinely. That wheel has been the bane of my entire morning. Creek bed's soft here when the snow melt comes down," he said. "You'll want to bring your wagon around by the upper trail." He untied his rope, coiled it, and set it back in her wagon bed. He retrieved his hat, which had fallen during the pushing, and put it back on his head. Then he turned to walk back to his fence. "Mr. Bancroft," she called after him. He stopped. "I make a very good coffee," she said. "When I find my coffee pot, which I am fairly certain is in the 3rd crate, if you'd like some once I get the wagon settled, you are welcome to it. It's the least I can do." He stood with his back to her for a moment, looking at his fence line, at the 3 wires he still needed to stretch and nail before sundown. He thought about what it would mean to sit and drink coffee with a stranger on a warm April morning when there was work to be done. He thought about how he had not done that kind of thing in 3 years. "I have wire to finish," he said. "Of course," she said pleasantly. "Another time." He walked back to his fence and picked up his pliers and got on with the work. He did not look back. But as he worked the wire through the staples, he was aware, in a way he had not been aware of anything in a very long time, of the sounds coming from the neighboring claim, the scrape of crates being unloaded, the soft chime of the birdcage swinging, the mule being tied somewhere sensible, and once, quite clearly, Myrtle Merriweather laughing at something the canary appeared to have said. He drove the last staple in harder than he needed to. That evening, Benjamin ate supper alone at the table in his cabin, the same as he had every evening for 3 years. He had built the cabin himself in the spring of 1878, when he had come out from Missouri with his wife Eleanor and their plans and their young ambition, and a wagon considerably better organized than Myrtle Merriweather's. Eleanor had loved this land from the first day she saw it, the way the mountain light came down in long orange columns across the sage flats, the way the silence had texture to it out here, full of wind and the distant sound of water. They had built the cabin, dug the well, turned the first soil of the vegetable garden. They had talked about children. They had made plans the way young people make plans, without the full understanding of how fragile plans are. Eleanor had died of fever in the January of 1879, fast and terrible, while the snow came down without stopping outside, and Benjamin had done everything a man could do, and it had not been enough. She had been 28 years old. He had not laughed since the last time she made him laugh, which was a cold November evening when she had imitated the particular way their neighbor's dog sneezed, and he had laughed so hard he'd spilled his coffee, and she had looked so pleased with herself that he'd laughed again just looking at her. After she was gone, laughter had seemed like a wrong thing, not because he had forbidden it consciously, but because the part of him that had generated it appeared to have gone quiet in some fundamental way, the way a spring goes quiet in dry summer. He had worked his claim. He had kept the cattle. He had traded in Durango when he needed to. He had answered questions when asked and spoken civilly when spoken to, and been a perfectly adequate member of the surrounding community. He had simply not laughed. He washed his plate and set it to dry and stood at his window in the dark, looking across the ridge toward where a lamp was burning in what had been Harlan Cutter's old cabin. The light moved once, as if someone was carrying it from one room to another, and then it settled. The canary, he noted, had been given a spot near what appeared to be the south window. He went to bed. The second day she was up before him. He knew this because when he came out to start on the morning feeding, he could already smell wood smoke from across the ridge, and when the wind shifted, something else, something that might have been cinnamon, though he told himself that was unlikely. He did the feeding and watered the horses and checked the young cattle in the north pasture, and came back and made his own breakfast, which was salt pork and cornbread and coffee that was adequate but not distinguished. He was eating at the table by the window when he saw her cross the ridge line at a quick walk, heading toward his fence gate with something in her hand. He watched her come with the still, patient attention he gave to all things he could not immediately categorize. She was wearing the same dark green dress from yesterday, or one very similar to it, and her hair was pinned up properly this time. She reached his gate and stopped and called out, because she was the kind of person who called out rather than knocking without announcement. "Mr. Bancroft, I have brought you something by way of apology for monopolizing your morning yesterday." He went to the door and opened it. She was holding a cloth-wrapped bundle that, when he looked at it, resolved itself into a plate of something, still warm from the smell of it. "Cornbread with dried apple," she said, extending it toward him. "I found my apple stores intact, which was a miracle, so I made some while the stove was getting going. It is not a replacement for your morning's work, and I recognize that, but it is genuine." He took the plate, because refusing it would have been rude, and he was not a rude man. He looked down at it. The cornbread was golden and a little uneven at the edges, the way things made in a traveling stove tend to be, and there were pieces of dried apple folded through it that had caramelized in the heat. "Thank you," he said. "You are very welcome," she said. She looked past him into the cabin with the frank curiosity of someone who is interested in the world and sees no reason to pretend otherwise. He did not step back to invite her in, and she did not push. "I wanted to ask also, and tell me plainly if it is too much of an imposition, whether you might know where the nearest town for supplies is. I know Durango is east, but I was told there is a smaller trading post that is closer for day-to-day needs." "Gilmore's," he said. 3 miles north along the creek trail. He keeps flour, salt, nails, lamp oil. Closes on Sundays." "Gilmore's," she repeated, and he could see her committing it to memory with the same efficiency with which she had assessed the mule situation the day before. "And is Mr. Gilmore a reasonable man to deal with?" "Reasonable enough. His prices are fair. He adds a penny on credit, but most people pay straight." She nodded. "Good, thank you. That is genuinely helpful." She looked at him for a moment, not with that particular kind of look that women sometimes turned on him out of pity or curiosity about the solitary widower on the Bancroft claim, but with something cleaner than that, something that was simply attention. "I will let you get on with your morning," she said. "Good day, Mr. Bancroft." "Good day," he said. He closed the door and ate the cornbread standing up at the table, still looking out the window as she walked back across the ridge. It was, he noted without intending to, the best cornbread he had eaten in 3 years. The apple had a tartness to it that kept it from being sweet, and there was something else in the spicing cardamom, possibly, which was an unusual choice that made the whole thing more interesting than expected. He washed the plate and set it aside to return to her, and then he went out to work, and he did not think about it after that. Or at least that was what he told himself, while the image of her walking back over the ridge kept coming back to him with irritating persistence throughout the morning. By the end of the first week, she had made the old Cutter cabin into something that looked like a home. He could see the change from his own land. The window that had been boarded got its boards pried off and new glass fitted. The front step that had been rotted got rebuilt with new lumber. The yard that had been a tangle of dry grass was being cleared in systematic sections that spoke of a woman with a plan. She moved with purpose and without wasted motion, and she apparently started every day before 6 in the morning, because the lamp was always lit, and the smoke already going when Benjamin came out. He told himself he was only observant because his property and hers were adjacent. On Thursday of the first week, she appeared at his fence gate again, this time in the late afternoon when the light was going golden and the shadows were stretching long across the sage. "I need advice," she said when he came to the gate. "Not help, just advice. I want to be clear about that. I have a post that needs setting on the southwest corner of my cabin, and I believe I have been reading the ground wrong. The soil there seems different. I do not want to set the post and have it heave in the spring." He looked at her. A woman who distinguished between needing advice and needing help was, he found, an unusual and somewhat arresting thing. "I'll look at it," he said. They walked together across the ridge. The canary sang as they came through the door, and Myrtle said absently, "That is Handel. He does that whenever someone new comes in. He was my mother's bird." And Benjamin looked at the small yellow creature in its cage and felt that it was regarding him with considerable judgment. The post situation was exactly as she had described. The southwest corner sat over a thin layer of topsoil above clay, which would in fact heave and shift with the freeze-thaw cycle. He told her to go down 18 inches instead of 12, and to pack the base with small gravel before setting the post. She listened with her arms crossed and her head slightly tilted, the way someone listens when they are genuinely receiving information rather than waiting for their turn to speak. "And if I go 18 and pack with gravel, it holds through spring thaw?" she asked. "Should do," he said. "Did it on 3 of my fence posts in '79 and they haven't shifted." She nodded once, decisive. "Good, that is what I'll do." She looked at him and then at the lamp on the table. "I have coffee on if you want some. And I will not take it as obligation. It is just coffee." He looked at the lamp and then out the window at the light on his own cabin across the ridge, and then at his hands, and then at Handel the canary who was watching him with those small bright eyes. "1 cup," he said. She poured it from a blue enamel pot, the kind of deep, dark, properly made range coffee that comes from a woman who has made it the same way for years. And she set it in front of him at the table with a small clay bowl of sugar that he declined with a shake of his head, because he had never taken sugar. She sat across from him with her own cup, and she did not fill the silence with nervous conversation, which was the thing he had always hated most about social obligation. The way people felt silence was a gap to be stuffed. She let the silence be what it was, and after a moment he found himself saying, "Where did you come from?" "Ohio," she said. "Cincinnati. Before that, Pennsylvania. My husband and I came out 4 years ago." She paused, and something moved across her face, brief and controlled. "He passed 2 years ago. A mining accident near Silverton. I have been settling his affairs and deciding what to do, and what I decided was this." She gestured at the cabin around her, at the repaired window, at the post she intended to set properly, at all of it. "This claim specifically?" he asked. "I had a little money from the settlement and I wanted land," she said. "Something I could work and make into something real. The land agent in Durango showed me several parcels, and this one had the best water access and the best southern exposure for a kitchen garden. Also," she said, and there was a note in her voice that he could not quite identify, something dry and slightly amused, "it was the least expensive, which was practical." He drank his coffee. It was, as she had said it would be, very good. "Your husband's name?" he asked, and then was not entirely sure why he had asked it. "William," she said. "William Merriweather. He was a good man. He worked hard and he was kind, and the world is the lesser for his absence from it." She said it plainly, without the quaver of unresolved grief or the defensive flatness of someone who had been asked the question too many times. She said it the way someone says a true thing. Benjamin put down his cup. "My wife was a leaner," he said. 1879. Myrtle looked at him. "I'm sorry," she said, and it was the 2 cleanest words anyone had said to him on that subject. "So was I," he said. He finished the coffee and stood and put on his hat. "Thank you for the coffee," he said. "Thank you for the advice about the post," she said. "I'll dig down 18 tomorrow." He walked back across the ridge in the evening light, and the mountains were pink and the sage was silver, and somewhere behind him, Handel was singing in his cage, and Benjamin Bancroft felt something shift in his chest. Not dramatically, not the way things shift in stories, but the way ice shifts in spring, a small settling in a structure that had been rigid for too long. He was not sure what to make of it. By the second week of May, Myrtle Merriweather had become a presence that was simply part of the landscape of his days. Not intrusive, She was not that kind of neighbor, but present in the way that a landmark is present, so that after a while you begin to notice when it catches the light differently, or when the shadow it throws is longer than usual. He had been to her cabin for coffee twice more. She had come to his fence gate twice with practical questions about the soil and the water table and the best way to handle the deer that kept getting into the root vegetables. Each time they had talked for longer than was strictly necessary to address the question at hand, and each time Benjamin walked back across the ridge afterward with the odd feeling of a man who has been sitting in a warm room and stepped outside, and only now realizes how cold it had been before. Durango, 3 times a week, was a necessity for Benjamin. He had cattle to sell, supplies to bring in, and a relationship of long standing with the livestock dealer there named Hector Ruiz, who was a compact and serious man of 50 who had been buying Benjamin's beef for 4 years, and who greeted him each time with the kind of businesslike warmth that Benjamin found appropriate and comfortable. It was on the second Tuesday in May that Benjamin was at Hector's yard when Myrtle Merriweather came down the main street of Durango on her gray mule, and the town turned its head to look at her the way a small town always looks at someone new. She tied the mule outside the dry goods store and went in, and Benjamin finished his business with Hector and was loading his wagon when she came out again with a crate and a conversation going on behind her. The proprietor's wife, a woman named Clara Dodd, who had the particular social energy of someone who considers herself the town's primary historian. "And you're over on the old Cutter claim," you said. Clara was saying, following Myrtle out with the air of a woman who will follow as far as necessary to get the whole story. "That's right," said Myrtle, settling the crate in her saddlebag with competent hands. "All alone out there," said Clara. "Myself and my mule and my canary," said Myrtle pleasantly. "My," said Clara, in a tone that contained considerable meaning. "Well, you'll want to know that the Bancroft place is just adjacent, and Benjamin Bancroft is a perfectly decent man, though he keeps to himself terribly. Terrible tragedy, of course, with his wife. Though it's been, 3 years now, so perhaps, Mrs. Dodd," said Myrtle in a voice that was perfectly friendly and absolutely firm. "I appreciate you taking the time. Good afternoon." She untied the mule, and as she turned to mount she caught Benjamin's eye across the street, and for a moment he saw something in her face that was part amusement and part acknowledgement, as if to say, "Yes, this is the thing I have also been navigating, and I handle it the same way you do, and we need not discuss it further." He touched the brim of his hat. She touched the brim of hers. They did not discuss it further. On the 3rd week of May, a man named Garrett Sloane arrived in the region. Sloane was not from Durango, and he was not the kind of man who introduced himself to people he did not intend to use. He was a land speculator, though he preferred to call himself a property development agent, and he had been buying up abandoned claims in the county through various methods, some of which were legal and some of which required closer examination. He was tall and smooth-faced and wore a coat that was better than the surroundings warranted, and he came to Myrtle Merriweather's door on a Thursday afternoon when Benjamin was in the north pasture, and therefore not there to hear any of it. What happened, as Myrtle told it to Benjamin later that evening. She came to his gate at dusk with a look on her face that he had not seen before, something tightly controlled over something that was working to be angry, was that Sloane had told her the claim she had purchased was subject to a prior lien that the Durango land agent had allegedly failed to disclose, and that if she could not produce the full set of purchase documents within 30 days, the claim would revert to the holding company he represented, and he was willing to offer her a fair price for any improvements she had made. "He said all of this very politely," said Myrtle, with a smile. Benjamin looked at her. "And your documents?" "I have them," she said, "every single page. I have the deed, the transfer of title, the receipt of payment, and the certificate of clear title from the county recorder. I had them checked by a lawyer in Cincinnati before I ever set foot in Colorado. I am not a foolish woman, Mr. Bancroft." "No," he said. "I know that. But he said the county records showed a different chain of title and that my documents might be considered fraudulent." Her voice was very even, but he could see the effort it took to keep it that way. "I don't believe him. I believe he is lying and that he knows exactly what he is doing. But I am a woman alone on a claim, and I do not know how much weight my word carries in a county court if it comes to that." Benjamin thought about this with the same methodical care he gave to fence lines and water tables. He thought about the county recorder, a man named Douglas Fitch who had been in the position for 6 years, and who was, as far as Benjamin could tell, an honest man. He thought about the lawyer in Durango, a man named Avery Walsh who was slow but careful. He thought about the fact that Sloan was not the first man to try this kind of thing in the San Juan Basin, where the railroad was pushing development and making land values climb, and where a woman alone was thought by certain kinds of men to be an easier mark than she was. "Avery Walsh is your man," he said. "In Durango. Take your documents to him first thing tomorrow and tell him what Sloan said, word for word if you can. And if Walsh cannot help." "Then we go to Denver," said Benjamin, and he was slightly surprised at his own use of the word we, and he could see that she had noted it too, though she did not remark on it. "I don't want to bring this to your door," she said. "It is my problem. Your problem and my neighbor's problem are the same problem," he said. "If Sloan can push you off that land, he'll look at mine next. I've had clear title for 4 years, and I have no intention of entertaining his attentions." She looked at him for a long moment. The last light of the evening was on the mountains behind her, and the sage was dark and fragrant, and somewhere down the valley a coyote said something to the sky. "All right," she said. "Walsh, tomorrow morning." They went together. He told himself it was practical, that having a neighboring landowner present would establish a pattern of community interest in the situation that would make it harder for Sloan to proceed quietly. It was true. It was also not the only reason, but he did not examine that too carefully. Walsh's office was a narrow room above the dry goods store, smelling of paper and old tobacco. Walsh himself was a heavy, slow-moving man of 60 who listened to Myrtle's account with his eyes closed, which was not a sign of inattention, but rather how he concentrated. When she finished, he opened his eyes and held out his hand for the documents, which she produced from a leather case that she had evidently kept with her since yesterday on the principle that no document you need should ever be left anywhere it could be tampered with. Walsh read. He read for a long time while Benjamin and Myrtle sat on the 2 plain chairs in front of his desk, and the sounds of Durango's Main Street came up through the window. At some point a dog barked for a sustained period and was eventually silenced. Walsh read on. "These are in perfect order," he said at last. "The title is clear. The chain is unbroken. Sloan's claim of a prior lien is, as far as I can determine, without foundation." He looked up at Myrtle over his glasses. "That said, I would like to check with Fitch at the county recorder's office directly to confirm what Sloan claims he saw in the records. It is possible he manufactured a story from whole cloth. It is also possible there is a clerical error in the county records that someone has been paid to manufacture." Myrtle's jaw tightened. "Can that be investigated?" "It can," said Walsh. "It takes time, and it will cost something, though I will try to keep it reasonable." He looked at Benjamin. "You have an interest in this, Bancroft." "Adjacent claim," said Benjamin. "I have an interest in who holds what land on my border," Walsh nodded. "Come back Friday. I'll have spoken to Fitch by then." On the way back down the street, Myrtle walked beside Benjamin without speaking for a half-block, and then she said, "Thank you for coming." "Walsh needed to see a property owner alongside you," he said. "It changes the weight of the visit." "Yes," she said, "but thank you anyway." He looked at her from the side, the way you look at something you don't want to be caught looking at directly. She was looking straight ahead down the dusty Main Street with that composed expression she wore when she was working a problem, and there was something about her particular combination of capability and vulnerability in that moment. The way she had produced her documents from the leather case, the way she had reported Sloan's words to Walsh without embellishment or panic, the way she had asked her questions with precise clarity. That hit Benjamin somewhere in the vicinity of the chest and did not immediately leave. He bought her a cup of coffee from the lunch counter at the hotel before they left town, and she accepted it with the easy grace of a woman who has long since stopped performing modesty about the things she wants. And they sat on the bench outside and drank it while the horses stood in the afternoon heat. And they talked for nearly an hour about nothing more consequential than the best variety of potato for Colorado soil, and whether the railroad was going to make it to Silverton before the decade was out. It was one of the best hours Benjamin Bancroft had spent in 3 years. He did not examine that too carefully either on the ride back. But the evening, when he came in and lit his lamp and cooked his supper, the cabin felt different in a way he could not account for by any change in the physical circumstances of the room. On Friday, Walsh told them that Fitch had found the county records to be in perfect order, that Sloane's claimed prior lien did not appear in any official document, and that in Walsh's considered opinion Sloane was bluffing, presenting fabricated information to a woman he assumed would not have the resources or the knowledge to challenge him, in order to purchase a claim he knew was becoming increasingly valuable as the railroad extended its reach through the region. Myrtle listened to this and then asked, with the precise calm of someone keeping a great deal of feeling under a well-maintained surface, whether there was anything Sloane could legally do to pursue the matter further. "If he files in the county court, you will win," said Walsh. "I will make sure of it, but I would recommend that you speak to Fitch yourself today and have him make a formal annotation in the records acknowledging your clear title and noting that no lien exists. That creates a documented record of your ownership that is much harder to challenge or tamper with." They went to Fitch. He was a lean, dry-humored man who shook Myrtle's hand and said that he had already had some thoughts about Garrett Sloane's activities in the county and that he was happy to make the annotation on the spot, which he did in careful ink, while Myrtle watched over his shoulder with the focused attention of someone witnessing something important, and Benjamin stood by the door, and it was done. Outside on the steps of the county building, Myrtle let out a long breath. It was the only sign she gave that she had been holding considerable tension since Thursday afternoon. "It's done," said Benjamin. "It is," she said. She turned and looked at him, and in the bright Colorado noon she looked like a woman who had just put something to rest, and also like a woman who was aware that she had not done it entirely alone. "I feel that I have imposed on you considerably, Mr. Bancroft." "You haven't," he said. "I told you it was my business too." "You told me that," she agreed. "But we both know it was my business primarily, and you came anyway." She looked at him steadily. "I don't take that lightly." He looked back at her, and the noon light was very bright, and the mountains were very clear in the distance, and he found that he had nothing to say that would be an adequate response to the directness of her regard. So he said, "Would you like to ride back together?" And she said, "Yes," and they did. June came, and with it the wildflowers, the yellow and purple kind that Benjamin could not have named individually, but that covered the sage flats in a way that surprised him every year, even though it happened every year. The mornings were warm and the evenings still cool, and his cattle were doing well, and the fence line along his north pasture that had been giving him trouble all spring was finally properly mended. He and Myrtle had developed, without formally discussing it or giving it any name, a pattern. Coffee in the evening every 2 or 3 days, sometimes at her cabin and sometimes at his. The practical conversations had by now run through most of the practical topics that genuinely required discussion: water rights, soil types, the 2 ranchers 5 miles north who ran their cattle close to the boundary lines and needed to be watched, the question of whether to extend his north fence and her west fence in the same direction so they could share the cost. There were still practical things to talk about, but they had mostly stopped being the reason for the conversations. One evening in the middle of June, Benjamin came to her cabin with a piece of tack that needed restitching and a general sense of purpose that he had manufactured in order to justify the walk across the ridge, and he found her on the porch in the last light of the evening, reading a letter with an expression on her face that he could see from a distance was unhappy. He slowed his pace but did not stop. She looked up when he reached the porch step. "My sister," she said, folding the letter and setting it on the porch rail with the careful movements of someone composing themselves. "She writes that she thinks I am making a mistake, that I should come back to Cincinnati, that I am wasting my time and my money on a wild venture." She paused. "She is not unkind, my sister. She is afraid for me." "And are you making a mistake?" Benjamin asked. Myrtle looked out over her land at the kitchen garden that was now 3 weeks into proper growth, the post she had set 18 inches deep and packed with gravel that stood perfectly straight, the repaired window with the lamplight showing through it, the mule tied up sensibly by the water trough, Handel's cage visible on the sill. All the small evidences of a woman who had built a life in a place she had chosen. "No," she said, "I'm not." He sat down on the porch step because it was the natural thing to do, and she sat in the chair she had put on the porch 2 weeks ago and which was now weathered enough to look like it had always been there, and he said, "Does she have reason to worry about you?" "Generally." Myrtle considered this seriously. "When William died, I had a difficult year," she said. "I grieved badly and I made some poor decisions, and my sister bore the weight of it with me. So she worries. She is not wrong to worry. But she is wrong about this." She looked at her garden. "I have not felt like myself in 2 years. This land is the first thing since William died that has felt like something I chose rather than something that happened to me." Benjamin was quiet for a moment. Around them the evening sounds were settling in, the coyote down the valley, the wind in the sage, Handel murmuring to himself in his cage. "When Alina died," he said, and he said it slowly, "the way you say something you have not said in a long time, but that needs to be said. I spent the first year not feeling anything at all. Like the world had gone flat. Everything I did was just motion, moving through flat space." Myrtle was very still, listening. "The second year," he said, "it started to come back, the feeling. But it came back as pain first, and the pain was almost worse because at least the flatness was bearable." He looked at his hands on his knees. "I think I have been waiting for it to stop being pain and go back to something else. I was not sure what that something else was." "And now?" she asked, very quietly. He looked up at her. She was watching him with the same clean attention she had turned on him from the very first day, that look that had nothing in it of pity or performance, only genuine regard for what was there. "I think I might be finding out," he said. The silence that came after that was different from the silences they had shared before, fuller somehow, holding more than it was saying. Handel chose this moment to produce 3 clear, bright notes from inside the cabin, and despite himself, despite 3 years of not doing it, Benjamin made a sound that started as a breath and became something more, a small, surprised laugh, barely more than a release of air, at the impeccable timing of a yellow canary. It was a small laugh. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. But it was real. Myrtle heard it, and she looked at him, and something moved across her face that was warm and careful and glad, and she did not remark on it, because she was the kind of woman who understood that some things, if remarked on, will bolt like a startled horse. He stayed for coffee, and they talked about nothing serious for an hour, and when he walked back across the ridge in the dark, with the stars enormous overhead the way they only are at elevation, he felt something in him that he would not have been able to name if pressed, but that seemed, in some preliminary and unconfirmed way, like the distant edge of the possibility of joy. July in the San Juan Basin was fierce, hot, and alive. The sky turned an impossible blue that pressed down on the land like something physical, and the afternoon thunderstorms came up over the mountains with the reliability of a train schedule, building from white to dark in 2 hours, and then breaking in great cracking sheets of rain that smelled of pine and wet sage and ozone. Benjamin's cattle grew fat on the summer grass. Myrtle's kitchen garden produced with astonishing enthusiasm, more than she could use, so she began bringing him things over the ridge, an armload of pole beans, a basket of early tomatoes, a bunch of radishes tied with string, and he received them all with the same straightforward thanks and returned the basket each time, and sometimes with something in it. Eggs from the 3 hens he kept for personal use, or a jar of the honey he traded from a man 20 miles east who kept bees. An economy of mutual provision had grown up between them so naturally that neither of them had been aware it was happening until it was already a fact. It was Hector Ruiz who first said something direct on the subject. Benjamin was at his yard in mid-July, and Hector was looking at the heifer Benjamin had brought in with the expression of a man whose mind is only partly on cattle. "The widow on the Cutter claim," said Hector without preamble. "The Merriweather woman. You are on good terms with her." "Neighbors," said Benjamin. Hector looked at him with the calm patience of a man who has known Benjamin for 4 years. "Benjamin," he said, "I have known you 4 years. In 4 years I have seen you look animated precisely twice, once when the railroad announced the Silverton extension, and once last week in the street when you were talking to that woman about something that I could not hear but that clearly pleased you. I am not suggesting anything. I am observing." "Observe about the heifer," said Benjamin. Hector smiled, which was a rare and therefore notable event, and applied himself to the heifer. On the ride home, Benjamin thought about what Hector had said with the same steady attention he gave to everything he did not want to discard and did not know what to do with. He thought about it while the mountains went pink and the trail home wound through the sage, and by the time he got to his gate, he had not resolved it but he had acknowledged, in the private interior room where he kept his most honest assessments, that what he felt for Myrtle Merriweather was no longer a thing that could be adequately described as the ordinary regard of one neighbor for another. He did not do anything about this acknowledgment immediately, because he was Benjamin Bancroft, and Benjamin Bancroft did not act on things before he had thought them through from all angles. But that evening, when Myrtle came to his fence gate with a bundle of fresh-dried rosemary from her garden and asked if he might want some for cooking, he took the bundle and looked at her in the evening light and said, "Myrtle." The first time he had used her given name, he realized as he said it, "I wonder if you would like to come to supper on Sunday." She had gone still for a fraction of a second. Not with surprise exactly, but with the attention of someone receiving news they have been waiting for without knowing they were waiting. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." He made supper with the same methodical care he gave to all things. He had the salt pork, but he also traded for a good cut of beef from Hector, and he made a pot of beans with the rosemary from Myrtle's garden, and he made cornbread because he had learned from hers that he had been making his without enough fat. He set the table properly, with the 2 chairs at the corners rather than opposite ends, because the table was small and sitting opposite felt too much like a negotiation. He put the lamp in the center and trimmed it so the light was warm. She came at 6, having walked across the ridge with a cloth-covered plate that turned out to contain a dried apple and walnut cake that she set on the shelf beside the stove, and refused to discuss, until after supper on the grounds that discussing dessert before eating it was, in her considered opinion, an error in sequencing that led to the underappreciation of the main course. He found himself laughing again at this, not the small, startled exhalation of the canary moment, but something more full than that, something that came from the diaphragm and resolved into a grin. It was unexpected enough that he was aware of it happening, and he could see from the way her expression shifted that she was aware of it too and was glad of it. They ate supper and it was good, and they talked in the way they had been talking for 2 months now, with the comfort of established familiarity, but still the freshness of people who are still learning each other, finding new rooms in a house they have been visiting a while. After supper she produced the cake, and it was excellent, dense and sweet and slightly sharp with the apple. He had 2 pieces, which she recorded with visible satisfaction. After the second piece he put down his fork and looked at her across the small table in the lamplight. "Myrtle," he said, "I want to say something plainly because I think you are a woman who prefers plain speech." She looked back at him with those clear dark eyes and said nothing, only waited. I have been a man who kept to himself for 3 years, he said. By preference and by circumstances both. I was not looking for change. I was not particularly unhappy with things as they were, or I told myself I was not. He paused. Since you arrived on the neighboring claim, I have found myself looking forward to things. And I am not entirely certain what to do with that, because I have not felt that way in some time. And I want to be honest with you, it is also complicated by the fact that I understand you are still carrying your own grief and your own history, and I would not for anything make you feel pressured or obligated. Myrtle listened to all of this. Then she folded her hands on the table and looked at them for a moment, and then she looked up at him. Benjamin, she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and he felt it with a physical distinctness he had not been prepared for. I came to this land because I needed something of my own. I was not looking for anything else. I want you to know that is true. She paused. It is also true that for the past 2 months I have been very much looking forward to things, and I am a woman who has learned the difference between what she can afford to ignore and what she cannot. The lamp burned between them, and the night outside was full of Colorado summer sounds, and Handel was presumably silent across the ridge, and what happened next was neither dramatic nor hurried. Benjamin reached across the table and laid his hand over hers, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that in the lamplight for a while, not saying anything, letting the plain fact of it be what it was. He walked her home across the ridge in the dark, and at her door she turned and looked at him, and he said, "I would like to keep having supper together," and she said, "So would I." And then she went inside and the lamp came on in the window and he walked back under the enormous sky. And for the first time in 3 years, 2 months, and a considerable number of days, the silence of the Colorado night felt not like a weight but like something peaceful, something he was inside rather than trapped in. The trouble with Garrett Sloane was not finished, as it turned out. In the second week of August, Sloane came back. Benjamin was at Myrtle's cabin that morning. He had been helping her put up the north side of a small barn she was building for the mule and a second animal she was considering, and they were both on the roof putting down planks when the horseman appeared on the trail. Benjamin recognized him at 100 yards, the too-good coat, and the particular way he sat his horse as if the horse was an accessory. Myrtle saw the recognition in Benjamin's face and looked. Then she looked back at him. "Stay here," he said. "I certainly will not," she said, and began climbing down the ladder with the efficiency of a woman who has made her position clear. Sloane pulled up in the yard with the smile he apparently put on for all occasions, the one that suggested he was doing everyone an enormous favor by being present. "Mrs. Merriweather," he said, touching his hat, "and Mr. Bancroft, an unexpected pleasure." "I doubt it," said Myrtle. "What do you want, Mr. Sloane?" Sloane looked pained by the directness of this, the way a man looks pained by something he has manufactured the pain for. "I want only to make you a fair offer," he said. "I understand you've had Walsh look at your documents and spoken to Fitch about the records, and I respect your due diligence. I have no interest in a legal dispute. But I represent a group of investors who have considerable interest in this corridor for the railroad access, and I am authorized to offer you a price for your claim that is, I promise you, substantially above market value." "The answer is no," said Myrtle. "Perhaps if you heard the figure, the answer is still no," said Myrtle. "This is my land, it is not for sale, not at market value and not above it." Sloane's smile thinned slightly. He turned it toward Benjamin. "Bancroft, I wonder if you might help me help Mrs. Merriweather see the practical advantages." "No," said Benjamin. It was a very complete word as he used it. A silence fell over the yard. Sloane looked at the two of them, at Myrtle standing with her arms at her sides and her chin up, at Benjamin standing beside her with the particular quality of stillness that most men with any instinct for self-preservation correctly identified as more dangerous than motion, and his smile underwent a visible recalculation. "Well," he said, "I can see you've both made up your minds. I'll leave it at that for now." He touched his hat again. "Good day." He turned his horse and rode back the way he came. Benjamin and Myrtle both watched him until he was out of the yard. "He'll be back," said Myrtle. "Probably," said Benjamin, "or he'll try something different." "Such as?" Benjamin looked at her. "Go to Denver, register with the land office there as well as the county. The more official documentation you have in more places, the harder it is for him to manufacture confusion." She nodded slowly, already thinking through the logistics. "Denver is 3 days each way." "I know," he said. "I'll watch your animals while you go if you go." She looked at him. "Would you come with me?" He had not expected the question, and something in it, not just the practical sense it made, two landowners with adjacent stakes presenting together, went through him with a warmth he felt in his fingertips. "Yes," he said. They went to Denver in the 3rd week of August. They rode the train from Durango, which Myrtle regarded with bright interest, noting every mechanical detail with the attention of someone who finds the world genuinely interesting. The city, compared to the plateau, was enormous and loud, and full of a kind of energy that Benjamin found overwhelming in the way that he had always found cities overwhelming. But Myrtle navigated it with the purposeful calm of a woman from Cincinnati who knew what a city was, and was not distracted by it. The land office was a government building with long corridors and a smell of old paper and ink. And the clerk who received them was a young man named Patterson, who was thorough and somewhat bureaucratic in his procedures, but fundamentally helpful once he understood what they were registering and why. He recorded Myrtle's title in the Federal Land Register, made note of the county recorder's annotation, and gave her a federal certificate of ownership that was, as Walsh had predicted, essentially the last word on the matter. "Sloan cannot challenge a federal registration," Benjamin told her afterward on the steps of the land office with the Denver heat pressing down and the city noise all around them. "No," said Myrtle, holding the certificate with both hands and looking at it. "He cannot." She looked up. "It is done." "It is done," he agreed. They had a day in Denver before the return train, and they spent it in a way that neither of them planned and both of them enjoyed. Walking through a city they did not live in, looking at things, talking about things, eating a lunch at a proper restaurant where Benjamin was aware that they were observed as a couple by the surrounding tables, and found that this awareness did not trouble him the way he would have expected. In the late afternoon, they walked along the edge of a park where elms threw cool shadows, and there were children playing and couples sitting on benches, and the city performed its ordinary life around them. Benjamin and Myrtle walked at the pace of people who are in no hurry, and after a while their hands found each other the way hands do when they have been finding each other for a while, quietly and without announcement. They did not discuss what they were. They had not needed to yet, and both of them were, in their separate but compatible ways, people who let things declare themselves in their own time. On the train back, the mountains came up out of the plains in the golden late light, white-topped and enormous, and Myrtle sat beside him with her shoulder against his, and looked out the window at the approach of home with an expression that was so full of quiet, settled happiness that it made something in Benjamin's chest feel too large for the space it occupied. "Myrtle," he said. She turned to look at him. He had thought about how to say this because he was a man who thought about how to say things. He had gone over it in his mind several times. He had drafted versions of it in his head, considered them, found them wanting, simplified them. "I love you," he said. It was the simplest version, and he had decided it was the only correct one. She looked at him for a long moment with those clear dark eyes, and then she did something he had not seen her do before. She put her free hand up to the side of his face, very gently, and she said, "Benjamin, I have loved you since approximately the 2nd cup of coffee." He turned his face into her hand, and she made a sound that was both a laugh and something more than that. And then he kissed her with the same directness with which both of them approached all things, there on the train with the mountains coming home around them. September arrived with the first cold in the mornings, the frost that came before dawn and melted by 9, and reminded you that winter was organizing itself in the high country. Benjamin's cattle were fat and ready for Hector, and the harvest from both their gardens was more than sufficient, and the small barn on Myrtle's claim was finished and housing her mule and the second horse she had purchased, a young red mare named Cecily who had good manners and an expressive face. They were at a point in their relationship that required a decision, and both of them knew it. They were at each other's table most evenings. They worked each other's land as often as their own. They had told each other the true things, the ones about Eleanor and William, the grief and the years of flatness and the slow return to feeling. And in the telling of those things they had built between them something that was more than companionship and more than attraction, something that had the particular quality of things built properly, the right depth, the right material, the right structure. It was on a Tuesday evening in the middle of September, sitting on the porch of his cabin in the cool air, with the mountains going the particular color they went in autumn, copper and deep green and gold, that Benjamin said, "I want to marry you." Myrtle had been looking at the mountains. She turned to look at him. It was a look that was full of everything she was, the directness and the capability and the humor and the grief she had survived and the happiness she had built in spite of it. "I want to marry you too," she said. He exhaled. He had not been afraid exactly, but there was something that released in him with her answer, some last-held thing that let go of its grip. "I was afraid you might feel it was too soon," he said. "I'm 27 years old," she said. "I have been a widow for 2 years. I know what I want. Too soon is for people who don't yet know." She looked at him with a small smile that was entirely her own, that private warmth that she reserved for moments of genuine feeling. "I want to live here, on this land, near this land, permanently. I want to be your wife and I want you to be my husband. That is what I want." He took her hand. "Then that is what we'll do," he said. They were married by the circuit preacher on the second Saturday of October, 1882, in the yard of the Bancroft cabin, with the mountains at the height of their autumn color behind them, and the sage flat and silver, and the sky that impossible Colorado blue. Hector Ruiz came, and Walsh the lawyer, and Fitch the county recorder, and Clara Dodd from the dry goods store who wept considerably and with great enjoyment, and a few other neighbors from the surrounding valley who had heard the news and came with food and good wishes, and the particular warmth that small isolated communities extend to the formation of a new household. Myrtle wore the dark green dress, her best, with her hair pinned properly, and a small bunch of late asters that Hector's wife had pressed into her hands that morning. Benjamin wore his good coat and his good hat, and stood at the makeshift altar the preacher arranged in the yard looking at Myrtle walking toward him, and he felt a fullness in him that he had not felt in 3 years, and that he had been afraid was gone for good. And it was not gone. It had been here all along, waiting. The preacher, a compact man named Elias Thorne who had been riding the circuit since before the war and had married a great number of couples in a great number of landscapes, said the words, and they said the words back, and it was done. Benjamin kissed his wife in the October sunshine, and the assembled neighbors made a respectable noise about it, and even Handel, brought over in his cage for the occasion, contributed something bright and musical. The celebration that followed was the kind that Western settlements did well, impromptu, generous, slightly chaotic, and full of genuine joy. Someone had brought a fiddle. The food was communal and excellent, better than either of the married parties had produced alone. Clara Dodd told the story of meeting Myrtle for the first time on the Durango Main Street, as if she had been personally responsible for the outcome, which no one contradicted because it made her happy, and the afternoon was too good for corrections. Hector found Benjamin near the end of the afternoon, when the light was going orange and most people were full of good food, and beginning to think about their rides home. He stood beside Benjamin and looked at the yard and at Myrtle across it, who was talking to 2 women from the valley with the animated expression she had when she was genuinely enjoying a conversation. "I have known you 4 years," said Hector. I have not seen you look like this before." "No," said Benjamin, "you haven't." Hector clapped him once on the shoulder, which was the most expressive gesture he was capable of, and which carried considerable weight in proportion. The guests went home by dusk, and the yard was quiet, and the lamp was lit inside the cabin. And it was theirs, the cabin and the land and the life. The two claims side by side that were now, in every practical sense, one operation, though they had agreed to maintain the formal property lines for the time being because Myrtle had worked hard for her deed, and she intended to keep it in her name. That night, with the mountains invisible in the dark and the stars thick overhead, Benjamin lay awake for a while listening to his wife breathing beside him, and he thought about 3 years of silence, and about the morning a wagon had sunk into the soft ground by the creek bed, and a voice had cracked across the morning air with magnificent irritation, and he thought about all the cups of coffee and the post set 18 inches deep, and the trip to Denver, and the lamp in the window across the ridge. And he thought that grief was not a thing that ended so much as a thing that transformed, that became the shape of what came after it if you waited long enough and had someone worth waiting with. He fell asleep with his arm around Myrtle and slept the deep, settled sleep of a man who is where he is supposed to be. Winter came hard that year, the way Colorado winters come when they mean business, with 3 feet of snow in December and the temperature dropping to places that made the cattle miserable, and the chores take twice as long. They managed it together with a division of labor that had established itself naturally over the months of knowing each other, and was now simply the way their days worked. Benjamin handling the heavier stock work and the outer fences, Myrtle managing the provisions and the barn, and the morning milking of the 2 dairy cows she had added to her side of their combined operation. They ate breakfast together every morning and supper every evening, and in the evenings they sat by the fire, sometimes talking and sometimes not, Handel on his perch by the south window doing his small canary commentary on the proceedings. In those long winter evenings, they told each other more of their histories, not the formal summaries they had exchanged early on, but the textured, detailed kind, the stories of particular days and specific moments. She told him about growing up in Pennsylvania, about her father who had been a school teacher and who had instilled in her the habit of reading everything, hence the encyclopedias in the wagon, which she still had, and which were arranged on a shelf she had built into the cabin wall beside the window. He told her about Missouri, about his father's farm, about coming west with a leaner, and the particular quality of that first spring on the Colorado land, when everything had seemed possible in a way that the future only ever seems once. She listened to his stories about a leaner the way he listened to her stories about William, with complete attention, with the understanding of someone who had also loved and lost, and who knew that the presence of a previous love did not diminish a current one, but was simply part of the whole truth of a person. "She would have liked you," he said one evening, meaning a leaner, looking at the fire. "I think William would have liked you too," said Myrtle. "He would have respected the fence work if nothing else. He had a particular regard for people who did things properly." Benjamin laughed, and it was easy now, the way it had been easy in the time before, the way he had feared it would never be again. January brought a crisis with the north pasture fence. 3 posts heaved by the freeze and 2 young cattle found 2 miles off on Donohue's land to the north, where the Donahue brothers were not entirely pleased about the situation, though they returned the cattle without drama because they were, fundamentally, decent men. Benjamin spent 3 days in bitter cold repairing the fence properly this time, with Myrtle bringing him hot coffee and working the second post herself when his hands were too cold to manage the sledge efficiently. "You know," she said, driving a staple with considerably more force than the staple required, because she had learned early that attacking wire was more effective than coaxing it. "When I imagined moving to the Colorado Territory, I did imagine some of this. The physical work of it, the difficulty of the winters, and the other things," he asked, blowing on his hands inside his gloves. "What other things?" He looked at her across the fence wire. "The things you did not anticipate." She stopped and looked back at him, and the January sun was thin and pale, and her breath made small clouds in the cold air, and she had a smear of dirt on her cheek from where she had pushed her hat back with a dirty hand, and she was wearing his extra coat over her own because the morning had turned colder than expected, and she looked at him with that expression that he now recognized as her full, unguarded attention. "No," she said quietly. "I did not anticipate those things." He kissed her over the fence wire, which was impractical but which she seemed to find acceptable. March brought a letter from Myrtle's sister in Cincinnati. Emily, the sister, had written more warmly than before. In response to a long letter Myrtle had sent in January describing her marriage and her life in detail, and asking Emily to come and visit when the weather allowed. Emily had a husband and 2 young children, and travel from Cincinnati to Colorado was not simple, but the letter had something in it that was different from the worried earlier ones. Something that read like a woman who had looked at what her sister had written and understood, finally, that this was not a wild venture, and that Myrtle was not in difficulty but was, in fact, happy. "She wants to come in the summer," Myrtle told Benjamin, reading the letter at the breakfast table. "Good," he said. She looked up. "You don't mind?" "Why would I mind?" he said. "This is your home. Your family is welcome in your home." She looked at him with that warmth that he had learned meant something she was feeling more deeply than she was currently expressing, and then she went back to the letter. Emily Hargrove arrived in July 1883 with her husband Thomas, a quiet accountant from Cincinnati, who turned out to get along with Benjamin very well on the basis of their shared appreciation for things done correctly, and their 2 boys, aged 6 and 4, who immediately adopted Benjamin as a figure of tremendous interest on the grounds that he had real cattle and a real barn, and was willing to let small people assist with feeding. Emily was a version of Myrtle built on a slightly smaller and more anxious frame, and she spent the first day of her visit watching her sister with the careful attention of someone checking a wound to see if it has healed. And then, by the end of the first afternoon, when she had watched Myrtle walk through her garden with the ease of someone who has been walking it for a year, and watched her argue cheerfully with Benjamin about the best place to put a second water trough, and watched them stand together at the ridge line in the evening light looking at the mountains with the quiet companionship of people who have found each other, Emily came to sit beside her sister on the porch, and she took Myrtle's hand and said, "You are all right." "I told you I was," said Myrtle. "I know," said Emily, "but I needed to see it." She looked at Benjamin across the yard where he was showing the older boy something about a fence post with the patient, methodical manner he brought to all teaching. "He is a good man." "He is a very good man," said Myrtle, "and you are happy." Myrtle looked at her land, at the mountains, at her husband, at the fat summer garden and the canary in the window, and the post she had set herself at 18 inches deep that still stood perfectly straight, and she said, "Emily, I am happier than I have been in years. I am where I belong." Emily squeezed her hand once, and that was the end of that. In the autumn of 1883, Myrtle told Benjamin she was expecting a child. She told him in the early morning over coffee, with the matter-of-fact directness of a woman delivering information she has already had time to consider, and then she watched him across the table with those clear eyes, waiting to see what he did with the information. What he did was go very still for a moment, the way he went still when he was taking something in entirely, and then he looked at her, and what was in his face was something so unguarded and whole that it went through her like light through water. "Myrtle," he said, and his voice was not entirely steady. "I know," she said. "I feel the same way." He came around the table and she stood and he held her, and she could feel the steadiness of him, the solid particular fact of him, and she thought about a wagon wheel sunk in soft ground and a man who had not laughed in 3 years coming across the ridge because it was the practical thing to do. The child was born in April of 1884, a boy delivered by the midwife from Durango, a competent and unflappable woman named Mrs. Garza, who had delivered half the children in the San Juan Basin and who said, when it was done and the baby was in Myrtle's arms, that she had rarely seen a new father look more grateful. Benjamin stood at the side of the bed looking at his son with an expression that was entirely beyond his management. All the composed steadiness he normally maintained completely absent, replaced by something raw and good and overwhelming. The boy was red and angry about the world, and had an impressive amount of hair and an opinion about his surroundings that he was expressing at considerable volume. "He is extraordinary," said Benjamin, which was not an objective assessment but was absolutely true. "He is," said Myrtle, who was tired in a way that went all the way through her and happy in a way that went further. They named him Thomas Henry Bancroft, Thomas for Myrtle's sister's husband, who had shown particular kindness the previous summer, and Henry for Benjamin's father, who had taught him the value of doing things properly. Thomas Henry was a child of considerable personality from very early on. By 6 months, he had strong views about everything in his immediate environment, and was not shy about communicating them. He took to Handel the canary with a devotion that Handel appeared to return, and one of the early pleasures of Benjamin's days was watching his son and the old yellow bird regard each other from 2 feet apart with a shared intensity that suggested they were conducting a complex conversation in a language only the two of them had access to. The years that followed were the kind that fill themselves in ways you do not fully register until you look back at them from a sufficient distance. They were good years, full of work and difficulty, and the particular satisfactions of building a life with someone you trust completely. The two claims operated now as one ranch in all but the deed, and their cattle herd was the best in the valley, and Myrtle's kitchen garden had expanded into a market garden that supplied 3 households in the valley in summer, and which she managed with the same systematic intelligence she brought to everything she undertook. Thomas grew from a red, opinionated infant into a sturdy, curious boy who had Benjamin's steadiness and Myrtle's directness, and his own particular quality of absolute cheerfulness in the face of all difficulty, as if the world were fundamentally interesting, and whatever happened in it was simply more information about how interesting it was. In 1886 they had a daughter, Clara Rose Clara, for the woman in the dry goods store who had, in her own way, been the first to note their connection, and Rose because Myrtle liked the word, and because the baby had arrived in late May when the wild roses were beginning on the ridge. Clara Rose was quieter than her brother from the start, a watching, thoughtful child who appeared to be assembling a comprehensive picture of everything she observed before deciding to act on any of it, which was, Benjamin told Myrtle, entirely familiar. "She gets it from both of us," said Myrtle. "She gets it from you," he said. Myrtle threw a dish towel at him, which was approximately how most of their domestic disagreements resolved themselves. Garrett Sloane made one final appearance in their story, in the spring of 1885, when word came through Walsh that he had attempted to challenge the land titles of 3 other small operations in the county, using the same manufactured lien approach he had tried on Myrtle, and that 2 of the 3, both women alone, had been frightened into selling at well below value before they could get legal representation. Walsh and Fitch together had built a case that resulted in Sloane being brought before the county court in Durango, where his methods were examined in some detail. Benjamin testified about the approach Sloane had made to Myrtle. Myrtle testified herself, with the federal certificate of ownership in her hand, and a calm precision in her testimony that Walsh afterward described as the most effective he had seen from a lay witness in his career. Sloane was not jailed. The law of the territory in 1885 was not perfectly equipped to deal with land fraud of the sophisticated variety, and certain edges of his activity were difficult to prosecute cleanly. But he was fined substantially. His holding company was dissolved by court order, and the two women who had been pressured into selling received compensatory payments that, while not fully recovering what they had lost, at least acknowledged the wrong. And Sloane left the county and did not return, which was the outcome that mattered most. Walking out of the courthouse in Durango after the verdict, Myrtle took Benjamin's arm in a way that was both habitual and deliberate, and she said, "That is done. That is done," he agreed. She looked up at him with the sun on her face, and that clear, warm look in her eyes that he had come to understand was her particular expression of deep contentment. "Are you happy?" she asked, which was a question she asked him occasionally, not from anxiety but from genuine curiosity, because she was a woman who was interested in the truth of things. He looked at the street and the mountain beyond it and then at his wife, and he said, "Myrtle, I am the happiest I have ever been in my life." She smiled with her whole face, the way she did when something pleased her completely, and she squeezed his arm and they walked on down the dusty main street of Durango in the spring sunshine. Handel the canary died in the winter of 1887, of old age, having outlived his expected years considerably. Myrtle buried him in the kitchen garden with a small ceremony attended by Thomas, who was 3 and treated the occasion with solemn dignity, and Clara Rose, who was not yet a year old and was held by Benjamin, and appeared to regard the proceedings with her characteristic thoughtful attention. Myrtle said that Handel had been the best possible companion for the hardest years, and that she was grateful for every note of song he had ever produced. And Benjamin held his daughter against his chest and watched his wife say goodbye to a small yellow bird, and felt a tenderness so large that it pressed against the inside of his ribs like the mountains pressed against the sky. They got a new canary in the spring, a green and yellow one that Thomas named Button for reasons that were entirely his own and that no one questioned. Button was younger and louder than Handel and had less judgment about timing, but he had his own considerable personality, and he settled into the cabin as if he had always been there, which, after a few weeks, it felt like he had. The ranch expanded again in 1888, when Benjamin negotiated the purchase of a parcel to the north that had been abandoned by the Donahue brothers, who were moving their operation to New Mexico for reasons the brothers kept private, and which Benjamin and Myrtle agreed was their business. The new parcel gave them winter grazing access that had been the last remaining practical limitation on the size of their herd, and with it they were, in all the ways that mattered, exactly as established and solid on their land as any operation in the San Juan Basin. A third child came in 1889, another boy, whom they named Walter James Bancroft Walter because both of them simply liked it, and James for Walsh the lawyer who had, Benjamin had long since concluded, been a more important figure in the foundation of his current happiness than he had probably ever been given credit for. Walter was from his earliest days a person of emphatic physical energy and absolute good nature, who appeared to regard the world as a venue specifically designed for his enjoyment, and who kept Myrtle and Benjamin in a state of warm exhaustion that they would not have traded for anything. On the evening of the last day of October 1889, Benjamin sat on the porch of the cabin, his cabin, their cabin, the cabin he had built in 1878, and that had been the scene of so much grief and so much joy since. And he watched the sun go down behind the mountains in a display of such extravagant color that it looked like something from one of Myrtle's encyclopedias. Thomas was in the yard practicing with the small rope he had been given, with the serious focus of a 6-year-old, who has decided that roping is the most important skill in the world. Clara Rose was inside with Myrtle and Walter, the sounds of the three of them audible through the window, Button contributing his notes to the conversation. He had not laughed in 3 years once. He had counted the days. He laughed now approximately every day, often about small things, about the canary's timing, about Thomas's opinions, about the particular way his daughter looked at problems, about Myrtle's irreducible directness and the permanent slight crookedness of her hat when she was working, about the accumulated small comedy of a life being lived fully. The door opened, and Myrtle came out with 2 cups of coffee, Walter on her hip, and she handed him one and sat beside him, and they looked at the mountains together. Walter reached for the coffee with the ambition of a very young person who believes that whatever the adults have must be better than what he has, and Myrtle redirected his hand with the absent expertise of a woman who had been doing this for 6 years. "Thomas is going to lasso the fence post," Benjamin said. "He's been trying for 4 days," said Myrtle. "He'll get it eventually." "He will," she agreed. "He has his father's patience." Benjamin drank his coffee and looked at his family in the last light of the day, at the mountains he had come to when he was young and full of plans, at the land he had worked through grief and kept through difficulty, and that was now, beyond any reasonable doubt, the right place in the world for him to be. Across the ridge, the window of the old Cutter cabin, Myrtle's cabin, their north barn now caught the sunset and reflected it back, a small bright rectangle of color in the evening. He thought about a wagon wheel in soft ground, and a voice cracking across the morning with magnificent irritation, and a woman in a dark green dress with her fists on her hips telling a mule exactly what she thought of it. He thought about the first time he had laughed, small and startled, at a canary's timing. He thought about all the distance between that morning and this one, and how it had been traveled not in great leaps but in small, ordinary steps, cups of coffee, practical conversations, a hand over his at a table, a kiss on a train with the mountains coming home. "Myrtle," he said. She looked at him with those clear dark eyes, Walter investigating the buttons on her coat, the sound of Thomas trying his rope in the yard behind them, the mountains doing their last magnificent work with the October light. "Thank you," he said, "for driving that wagon onto the neighboring claim." She looked at him for a moment with the small private smile that was entirely her own, and then she laughed her full, genuine laugh, the one that had first reached him across the ridge on an April morning, and that he understood, been listening for ever since. "You are very welcome," she said. "I had no idea at the time how well it would turn out." He put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and Walter patted his father's coat with one small, satisfied hand. And Thomas at last got his rope around the fence post and let out a whoop of triumph. And the Colorado evening came down over all of it in gold and rose, and the first cool breath of coming winter. And it was, Benjamin Bancroft thought, about as good as a life could get. He held his wife in the fading light, and he was full and whole and happy, and he had not stopped laughing since the day she arrived.